Hello, this is Jay Mitchell. We are back with another episode of Libertarian Censored podcast, going over all the posts in Libertarian Censored subreddit. Let's get right into it. So first we have Massey's parting shot posted by Plasman30, and that's a picture of Thomas Massey at his concession speech, and it says the text under him says, Massey lost his seat, but went out with one of the great parting speech shots in recent political memory, responding to a colleague's fawning Trump celebration post of 5 words, how do his boots taste? And yeah, I would agree with that. The Republican Party is pretty much nothing but a party of Trump bootlickers at this point, and anyone who dissents in it from him at all on pretty much anything, if they're not cozying up to Trump 24/7, he'll have them thrown out of the party. Just look at what happened to Thomas Massey, Marjorie Taylor Greene, Liz Cheney, etc., etc. And ultimately, I don't really care for everyone he's thrown out. But it's definitely shown that it's pretty much been Trump's cold personality for a while now. But it's definitely only got more and more obvious as the years have gone on. Next, we have Trump's corruption is brazen, obvious, and costly. Will enough Republicans try to stop him? From Reason.com, posted by Jolly Porcupine. And yeah, as I just said, Trump's ultimately, if you try and go against Trump too much, he'll have you thrown out of the party pretty much. Like he took out Thomas Massey out of his congressional seat and Marjorie Taylor Greene out of hers, etc., etc. And yeah, personally, I don't think anyone's Republicans are going to try and stop him because of that. But, ultimately, I'm sure if it was a Democrat doing the same thing, Reddit would be completely fine with it. And it just goes to show you that, Reddit has no values, only teams. Since Trump's the out group, they'll care about his corruption. But any member of the in group's corruption, they'll always sweep that under the rug. And that's just how politics works. It's not, most people don't have any principles or values, only teams. One letter bad, the other letter good. It's pretty much it. It's all politics for most people. Next we have, if Thomas Massey is the 2028 Libertarian nominee, who should his vice president be? Posted by Single Honeydew 1508, and that's a poll they posted, and their choices were Afroman, Justin Amash, Spike Cohen, Joe Jorgensen, Chase Oliver, or other. And yeah, personally, I think Afroman will be interesting, but I like Justin Amash too. The other ones have already been on the Libertarian Party ticket, so I don't know if I personally think they should give their voice to someone new, let someone new take a turn. But yeah, I definitely would go if I were Afroman or Amash to let someone new take a turn, I would say. And that's my thoughts there. Next we have, it's not just ICE stockpiling weapons. The IRS, EPA, and other feds are arming up too, from Reason.com, hosted by Jolly Porcupine. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for the federal agencies arming themselves, but ultimately, that's how the federal agencies work. That's how they can control the law through enforcement, and usually that enforcement is going to include physical force, which does usually prerequisite firearms. And yeah, I personally don't really care for that, but ultimately, the government can justify giving whatever agencies it wants firearms to oppress you with, and oftentimes there's nothing you can do about it. Right? Of course, doesn't like when ICE uses them, but they'd be fine probably if it was a more in-group agency like the IRS, EPA, etc., etc. And it just goes to show you, they just follow their programming. They don't really care for anything other than whatever the current narrative is. And that just goes to show you, the people hate government authoritarianism unless they agree with it, and that's very much how politics works. People like authoritarianism, except when it's not their authoritarianism, then it's the worst thing ever. Next, we have PSA posted by Amugus Devilman, and that's a crosspost from the Anti-Com Action subreddit, and that's a note, the meme of the note of the one kid handing a note to the other kid, and the kid who handing the note is me, and is labeled me, and the other kid's labeled commies, and the commie opens the note, and it says, just because you want something doesn't mean it's right. And I'd agree with that. Ultimately, if you can say something's right, but that doesn't necessarily make it so. Ultimately, rights, I would say, come from within first and foremost. For something to be a right, people have to have the agency to back it up. If you can say you have freedom of speech, but if you don't have the agency to back up your freedom of speech, then that's not really a right, I would say. And that's true for every right. Ultimately, all rights are derived from an individual's agency rather than just naturally existing, I would say. And that's my thoughts there. Next, we have End the Wars, posted by Marky Jr., and that's a meme they did, or I don't really say it's a meme. It's I guess a more of a call to action. It says, "Contact your elected reps. No more war in Iran and Cuba." And they added, "Contact your federal representatives and let them know." And yeah, personally, I definitely do think we should get out of Iran, and I don't think the Cuba war is even started yet, but we should definitely get out of that when it starts. And yeah, personally, I don't think the U.S. should be constantly getting involved in the affairs of other countries, but it doesn't really matter, in the long run, because the people in positions of power are the ones who really keep justifying it. And Trump can say he's America first on the campaign trail, but he'll get into office and be Israel first. So, it doesn't really matter who's the president. I'd say the president's mostly just a figurehead. The deep state military industrial complex, satanic club, lizard people, whatever you want to call them, they're the ones really running the country. Next, we have a $500,000 fine for a tax paperwork oversight from Reason.com, posted by Jai Porcupine. And yeah, personally, I don't think someone should get a $500,000 fine for a tax paperwork oversight, but ultimately the government can levy any fine it wants for any crime, for anything at once, and oftentimes there's nothing you can do about it. Ultimately, that's how the law works. It's going to come down to the individual discretion of who's signing the penalty. Someone can murder someone and get like a year in prison if the judge is lenient enough. Well, someone could say something mean online and get 20 years in prison, and that's just how the criminal justice system is going to work. It's going to be inherently subjective rather than objective. Next, we have U.S. Homeland Security put out alert on comedian who created parody ICE tip website U.S. Immigration from TheGuardian.com, posted by Ninja Lover, and that's cross-post from the stand-up subreddit. And yeah, personally, I don't think the U.S. should be putting out alerts for comedians who create parody websites, but ultimately the U.S. government can put out alerts for anyone it feels like, and oftentimes there's nothing you can do about it. Ultimately, that's how it is. The U.S. government can come after you for whatever reason it feels like because they're in a position of authority and you aren't, and that's just how the law works. Next, we have Listen to Bernie Sanders' moronic take on rights, and that's a YouTube video from Jan Helfield. It's Bernie Sanders, let's see, that's loading. Bernie Sanders' character views on View Rights Exposed, and then that was posted by Socialist Morons, and they added, "Holy shit, how is this dumb weasel still in office?" And yeah, I used to be a Bernie Sanders supporter. I do think, he's probably one of the more principled Democrats, even if, I disagree with him on some issues like economics. And yeah, but yeah, personally, I don't care what his take on rights are, because ultimately I would say rights, it doesn't really matter what people say rights are, because, it matters what people are willing to justify for their own individual agency in maintaining those rights, and that's ultimately what rights, I would say rights are. You just can't say some things are right, as I was talking about earlier, and expect it to be true. You can't just say food is right and expect food to magically spawn on your table. Ultimately, rights come from individual agency rather than anything else. Next, we have a Florida detention center was the harshest in the country. Then ICE stopped tracking details and use of force from Reason.com, posted by Jai Porcupine. And yeah, personally, I don't care for harsh detention centers, but ultimately, sometimes, that's how the government can have harsh detention centers, and there's nothing you can do about it. And if ICE doesn't want to track the use of force, ultimately they're in a position to not track anything they feel like. And yeah, that just goes to show you that, ultimately when it comes to the government, they can track or not track anything they feel like and have whatever detention centers they feel like. And oftentimes there's nothing you can do about it because they're in a position of authority and you aren't. Next, we have Harriet Martineau, hosted by PMJC2CA Free, and that's a cross-post from the Classical Liberalism subreddit. And it looks like a quote from Harriet Martineau. "It's hard to tell which is worse, the wide diffusion of things that are not true or the suppression of things that are true." And they added, and OP added, "Do not trust the government to determine truth, but I also do not trust Carol to remain rational without a culture of liberty, responsibility, and open inquiry. The answer to falsehood is not authoritarian control of speech. The answer to authoritarianism is not abandoning truth." And yeah, personally, my thoughts on that is that, ultimately, free speech does include freedom of misinformation, disinformation, hate speech, whatever you want to call it. Free speech is all speech. If you don't like it, that's fine, but you should be able to say whatever you want to without fear of going to prison for it. And yeah, ultimately, that you might say something offensive, rude, or borderline terroristic, but ultimately, I think, we got support freedom of speech as long as, as long as possible. Because, ultimately, if the government starts saying some speech is legal, it can justify saying any speech is legal, and that's my thoughts there. Next, we have runoff. If Thomas Massie is the 2020 Libertarian nominee who should Vice President B, posted by Single Honey do 1508, and that's a then they link to a poll, and the former U.S. Representative from Michigan versus the rapper who beat the police in court, after members of Justin Amash. And yeah, personally, I would be fine if either of those, Afterman might get a little more media attention, but I think Justin Amash is arguably more principled. But yeah, I'd be fine if either of those. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Focus on the Family's complete track record of anti-LGBTQ hate from unclosetedmedia.com, posted by Knee Concussions. And they said, Focus on the Family, FOTF, is a Christian ministry of a half-century history of anti-LGBTQ advocacy. Through the years, they've worked with the biggest American politicians and lawmakers passing maintaining laws to treat LGBTQ people as second-class citizens. The nonprofit, which today amasses more than $100 million a year in revenue, was founded by James Dobson, who believes secularism was the cause of the rapid decay of American society. This is my own personal writing. Please let me know if you find any glaring discrepancies or things I straight up got wrong. And yeah, personally, if you want to write an article on Focus on the Family and talk about how they're full of anti-LGBTQ hate, I think you should be able to. If you want to write an article on them and how they support family values, I think you should be able to. Ultimately, everyone's going to have a different perspective on everything, and I think that's important to remember as well. One person's anti-LGBTQ hate is another person's traditional family values, and I think that's important to remember as well. If you don't like what a group like Focus on the Family does, that's fine. But ultimately, as long as I would say they're not being funded by the government, they should be able to justify doing whatever they want to. Say if any woke LGBTQ group, they should be able to do whatever they want to, as long as they're not funded by the government. Ideally, at least, so the government can throw money at whatever group it feels like, and oftentimes there's nothing you can do about it. Also, a lot of pro and anti-LGBTQ groups both try and influence policy. Like, that's important to remember as well. But, ultimately, I don't think it really matters. Justify doing whatever you want to, as long as you're not hurting anyone else. Well, I know this user might say, oh, they're hurting the LGBTQ community. Well, in reality, you could say a lot of stuff that a lot of the pro-LGBTQ groups are hating on, Christians and straight people. But, ultimately, if you want to justify, say whatever you want to, as long as, you're not forcing your values on others. A lot of groups these days are inherently trying to force their values on others through the state, and that's not something that I think we should be justifying. Focus on the Family is arguably one of them, but you have a lot of pro-LGBTQ groups as well who try and enforce their values through the state. I would argue additionally to that. And that's my thoughts there. Next, we have Death of MAGA, Republicans Grapple with Trump Victory Over Thomas Massie from Newsweek.com, posted by Jajadi Porcupine. And yeah, personally, I don't really think this is the death of MAGA, considering the Trump-endorsed MAGA candidate won, at least according to his own terms. But, ultimately, I do think this is Trump's definitely lost control of what MAGA is. Well, I mean, he's pretty much is MAGA. I think a lot of the people like Thomas Massie and Marjorie Taylor Greene who've been kicked out of it are now trying to rebrand it more as America First. And yeah, that's definitely something I think, ultimately they should be doing. Ultimately, Trump's just gonna, he's just gonna go against anyone who goes against him too much, and sadly, that's just how he is. A lot of the Democrats have that same issue. You're not allowed to go against them too much, or they'll throw you out of the party. Same with Trump and the Republicans currently. That's just why both parties, I think, are really, not doing too well currently. They just keep having stricter and stricter party lines they want members to follow. Next, we have Nestor Act. President Trump has granted clemency to numerous individuals who have stolen hundreds of millions of Medicaid funds. Can we expect any of these folks to be shown the same mercy? McDonald, I'll take a different question. Posted by Donald Key, and that's crosspost from the Law subreddit, and I guess that's a clip of him saying that on Fox News. And yeah, personally, that's ultimately how government works. The government, if the president wants to grant clemency to individuals who have stolen hundreds of millions of Medicaid funds, because because he for whatever reason he wants to. Oftentimes, there's nothing you can do about it since he's in the position of authority and you aren't, and a lot of people will defer to whatever the president says in regards to matter of law, and that's my thoughts there. Next, we have the Republican Party is nothing more than the cult of Trump from Reason.com, posted by Giant Porcupine. And yeah, I personally would agree with that. Ultimately, that's how politics works. Whoever is the big figure at the top is usually going to get a cult of personality around them. And oftentimes there's nothing you can do about it. Reddit, of course, calls out Trump here, but, they were completely fine with the Joe Biden's cult of personality during his term and Barack Obama's cult of personality during his terms. And oftentimes, it just goes to show you that, oftentimes, what I think Libertarian solution is you got to end this cult of the presidency. I would say the presidency as an institution itself is inherently unsalvageable at this point. I would just cut the executive branch out entirely at this point. And that's my thoughts there. And that's personally, I would just cut out all three branches and just have the states run themselves, because I personally think the federal government as a whole is pretty unsalvageable, but that's just my thoughts on there. And I think we're going to wrap it up there. I'll see you guys in the next episode. Bye.